I'm going to take a moment just to deal with some business for which I served notice on Thursday, November 1st, and move that pursuant to Standing Orders 108 3C9, the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates invite the Interim President and CEO of Canada Post Corporation, Jessica McDonald, and the National President of Canadian Union of Postal Workers, Mike Palecek, to provide a briefing on the management practices of Canada Post, particularly the deplorable practice of targeting sick and vulnerable workers in response to the rotating strike taking place during the current round of collective bargaining, and that this briefing take place no later than Thursday, November 8th, 2018, which is of course why it's important that we deal with the motion today in order to be able to change our schedule for Thursday. I learned about this last Monday when I visited striking workers in Winnipeg on the picket line, and began hearing stories of workers that are on that are collecting their disability insurance because they're sick or they're injured. And when the rotating strike began, Canada Post issued a missive to their workers saying that if you're on short-term or long-term disability, or if you get a maternity leave top-up under the collective agreement, that Canada Post would be ceasing those benefits. That obviously puts those workers in a very difficult position. We know from the Phoenix disaster what it looks like when people don't get paid, what that means for their mortgage payments, what that means for, in this case, medication that those workers have to have. This isn't a necessary part of collective bargaining. It's certainly not any kind of fair collective bargaining. And for any corporation, particularly a Crown corporation, in the name of Canadians, to be targeting sick and vulnerable workers as a bargaining technique, I think is disgusting. And the evidence suggests that that's exactly what's going on. I've heard from a lot of postal workers that are on disability leave that are saying, yep, that's my story, that's what's happening to me, and thank you for trying to do something about it. So what I think is important is that we hear the facts, that we get the president and CEO of the company here to tell us their side of the story, whatever it may be. I've been trying to imagine how you justify doing this. I can't, so I would need to hear it from her. I'd like to hear from the president of the union, to hear some of those stories and to get their perspective on why this is happening and the mechanisms that even allow this to happen in the first place. So those are the reasons why I think this is really important, and it's important that we do it as soon as possible because these workers right now aren't getting paid. And the longer that we wait to get an assessment of the situation, and the longer that government waits in order to do something about it, the more likely it is that we're going to find ourselves in a situation where these workers are suffering material, lasting financial harm, and the other kinds of harm that come from not being able to make payments. So we've heard, for instance, from the call center that helps administer these benefits to workers. Since Canada Post made the announcement, they've been receiving more calls and workers are reporting anxiety, depression, in some cases suicidal ideation. So this is a real thing that's happening right now to people who work for a Crown corporation. It doesn't have to be happening, and I think it's important that we get to the bottom of it as the committee that's responsible for Canada Post. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have two people on my speakers list, Mr. McCauley and Mr. Peterson.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Blaikie. Generally, I would support this. Most importantly, I'd love to hear from the temporary president of Canada Post, but also the head of the union, whether this is purely a negotiating ploy instead of the Canada Post has tools to counter the rotating strikes. Are they doing this instead of a lockout or other issues? So I'd certainly like to hear that. But I would perhaps suggest that we also invite Minister Qualtrough to appear and explain the government's role with Canada Post. Several reasons on that. One, when we had the president, the interim president of Canada Post here 9 months ago, made it very clear we're very close to landing a new president for Canada Post. It's very clear the government has no intention of replacing or finding a permanent president right now for Canada Post. I think that's the reason for that is so that they can pin the strike and any bad feelings from the strike on an outgoing president, not a new president. I think that has to be addressed. We haven't seen the long-term plan yet from the government or from Canada Post, so it was actually promised to this committee when we had the president here on addressing issues such as the $8 to $9 million
Yeah, it was like a very
pension deficit,
last minute. I think it
and the
was
long-term
first
plan
day that
on
I was
how
here
it's
that
going
you
to
were out.
counter
And he was
FedEx,
like, "Can you do
UPS,
these?"
and
I
all
was
the
like,
others,
"Yeah,
and
sure."
how they're
I
going
had
to
no idea about this fire,
maintain a
but, like, I'll do
business
it.
model. So I think it's very important we actually hear both from the temporary president, but also perhaps from the union side, but also from the government. I've heard very clearly from Canada Post, they have not received their marching orders yet from this government on how they're going to address the pension issues, long-term viability, and the other things. So I fully support it, whether it's with or without Minister Qualtrough. I believe she should be here to discuss the broader issue at hand as well. But I support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you. So was Mr. McCauley, I don't know if that was proposing an amendment and if Mr. Blaikie deems it friendly or where we are procedurally, was that? I don't believe there was. Okay, so I just wanted to be clear. So I'm not going to address that point then because it's not formally part of the motion. So while we do certainly sympathize and empathize with the plight of the workers in these cases, and I do think that you raised a question, Mr. Blaikie, in question period today, the minister, which was the proper venue, the proper forum to do so. I just think that the two parties right now are at the bargaining table. We strongly encourage them to remain at the bargaining table. We'd hate to have our committee interfere with what's, I think, hopefully going to be a fruitful process. And I'm just wondering if there would be even a reluctance of these two parties to appear before our committee, given the fact they're clearly in the bargaining process right now, trying to come to a mediated resolution to the labor situation. So for those reasons, although we empathize and sympathize with the workers, I just think it would be inappropriate, and it may actually defeat the purpose of the motion if we bring these parties before the committee.
Mr. Blaikie, I have you on the list as well.
Thank you very much. Just a brief response to those points. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to say that this practice of targeting workers that are on sick leave or on maternity leave don't have to do with bargaining demands. So while I agree that outside interference in the bargaining process itself in terms of what's being discussed at the table is one thing, this is a management practice. This is a practice that the management of Canada Post has adopted in the name of Canadians to try and get leverage over the union at the table. It's not something that's happening at the table, and it's not about the demands at the table. It's about what's happening outside of that in order to affect negotiations. So I do think that this is something that would be within our purview. I do not believe that this would be inappropriate for the committee to look at. And I would just add that, one of the things to keep in mind when we're evaluating this kind of management strategy, I don't think it would be okay in any circumstance to make sick and vulnerable workers a pawn in negotiations. But this is a rotating strike. Canada Post is making its money. Mail is getting delivered. Packages are getting delivered. The revenue is coming in. These workers aren't seeing a dime. And so the response is completely disproportionate to what's being done when it comes to the rotating strike. And I think that's another reason, certainly not the only reason, but it's another important reason why Canada Post needs to stop this. So I would appreciate committee members' support in helping us get to the bottom. If there's different facts, I'm open to hearing them. That's why I'm asking that the CEO of Canada Post come here as well. But I haven't heard any credible countervailing facts. And in the absence of those, I think it's imperative that the government take responsibility for this and put a stop to it. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no others on my speaking list, which means we will go to a vote on the motion immediately. We could make this a recorded vote. In the affirmative, all in favor of the motion presented by Mr. Blaikie. Mr. McCauley in favor. Mr. Deltel, affirmative. Mr. Blaikie. All opposed. Madame Ratanzi, Mr. Breton, Madame Yip, Mr. Peterson, Mr. Drouin. The motion is defeated.